There is a covenant, an unspoken and universal vow that forms the very bedrock of human society. It is the promise that a parent will protect their child, that a mother will stand as a shield against the world's darkness. We take this vow as a fundamental truth, as reliable as gravity. It is why stories of its violation shake us to our core. They force us to question not just the individual, but the very nature of trust, love, and evil itself. Today we explore one of the most chilling breaches of that covenant ever recorded. This is not a story of a stranger in the night. This is a story of the monster who made the sandwiches, who kissed the scraped knees, who tucked her children into bed. This is the story of Diane Downs, a woman who crafted an elaborate fiction of a random attack to conceal a truth so horrifying it defies comprehension, that she herself aimed a gun at her 3 sleeping children in a car and pulled the trigger. To understand the depth of this betrayal, we must first paint the picture of the woman at its center. Diane Downs in the spring of 1983 was 27 years old. To the outside world in Chandler, Arizona, and later in Oregon, she was a vivacious, talkative, and strikingly attractive single mother. She worked as a postal carrier. She was bright, charming when she wanted to be, but beneath that carefully maintained exterior swirled a tempest of narcissism, obsessive fantasy, and a desperate, all-consuming need to be loved on her own impossible terms. Her life revolved around a married man named Lou Lewiston. Their affair was the central drama of her existence. She envisioned a life with him, a perfect romance. But Lewiston was clear about one thing. He did not want children. He did not want the responsibility, the complication, the baggage of her ready-made family. To Diane, her 3 beautiful children, 8-year-old Christy, 7-year-old Cheryl, and 3-year-old Danny, were not the center of her universe. They had become the primary obstacles to it. They were the lock on the door to her fantasy life, and in her twisted logic, to remove a lock, you must destroy it. This poisonous thought, nurtured in secret, festered until it ripened into a plan that required cold precision and a performance of a lifetime. She decided she would eliminate her children and craft herself as the tragic, heroic survivor of a random attack. She would be free of her burdens and win the sympathy and hopefully the devoted love of the man who wanted her childless. On May 19, 1983, she set this plan into motion. She packed her children into her light blue Toyota Celica. She told them they were going to see a friend. She drove from her home in Springfield, Oregon, down a dark, lonely stretch of road called Old Mohawk Road. The rain was falling. The children, lulled by the motion of the car, grew sleepy. It was there in that isolated darkness that the covenant was shattered. Diane Downs pulled the car over. She took a .22 caliber revolver and she pointed it into her own car, at her own children. What happened next was not a single chaotic moment of violence, but a calculated execution. The evidence would later show the chilling precision. She shot her daughter Cheryl first, then Christy, then little Danny. She even shot herself, a superficial through and through wound in her left forearm, to complete her victim narrative. Then she began her performance. She sped to the emergency room of Mackenzie Willamette Hospital, arriving just after 10 p.m. She burst from the car, screaming, hysterical, "My babies! My babies have been shot!" She spun a tale for the rushing medical staff and the police who soon arrived. A shaggy-haired stranger, a attempted carjacking, a violent struggle. She was the brave mother wounded in defense of her children. And in those first critical hours, they believed her. Why wouldn't they? The scene was one of visceral, heartbreaking horror. 3 small, innocent victims. A seemingly distraught mother. The community was terrified. A madman was on the loose. But even as the medical team fought to save the lives of Cheryl, Christy, and Danny, small, discordant notes began to sound in the symphony of Diane's tragedy. In the sterile, fluorescent chaos of the Mackenzie Willamette Hospital ER, 2 parallel dramas unfolded. One was a desperate medical battle to save 3 innocent lives. The other was the careful subconscious observation of the woman who brought them in. The medical staff, trained to deal with trauma, were also human, and human intuition began to ping like a radar. Diane's affect was wrong. Her hysterics seemed to have an on and off switch. Nurse Laura Baird would never forget catching Diane alone for a moment in a hallway smiling. It wasn't a nervous smile. It was a small, private, almost satisfied curl of the lips. It vanished when she was noticed. Then there was her preoccupation. While surgeons worked to remove bullets from her children's small bodies, Diane was reportedly more concerned with the fate of her car, asking if the police had found it, if her possessions were safe. She asked for a sandwich. She flirted with an orderly. These were not the actions of a mother in the white-hot grip of terror and grief. They were the actions of someone whose primary performance was over and who was now simply waiting. But the most damning testimony would come not from a nurse, but from a tiny, paralyzed voice in the intensive care unit. 8-year-old Christy Downs had survived a bullet to the chest. It had lacerated her aorta, causing a stroke that left her partially paralyzed and struggling with speech. She was in and out of consciousness, in immense pain and terrified, but she knew something. She had seen something. A police officer and a nurse stood by her bed. They leaned in close. Christy's voice was a thready whisper, her words slurred but agonizingly clear. Mommy shot me. Then a moment later, as if to clarify the nightmare, Mommy shot us. Those 5 words, whispered through pain and trauma, cut through Diane's elaborate fiction like a scalpel. Mommy shot us. For the investigators now swarming the case, the focus began to turn slowly but inexorably from hunting a shaggy-haired stranger to scrutinizing the mother herself. The physical evidence on that rainy road told a silent, brutal story that contradicted Diane's account. There were no skid marks indicating a sudden stop for a stranger. The shell casings from the .22 caliber gun were found inside the car on the front passenger floor and seat, not outside where a stranger would have been firing from the driver's window. The blood spatter patterns suggested the children were shot at close range while slumped and stationary. And then there was Diane's own wound. The bullet had passed cleanly through the soft tissue of her left forearm. Forensic experts noted that such a wound, while painful, was not immediately debilitating. More importantly, the trajectory and the lack of powder burns were inconsistent with being shot by an assailant leaning into the car. It was, however, perfectly consistent with a self-inflicted wound. The lead investigator, Lane County Sheriff's Detective Doug Welch, began to piece together a different picture. A picture of a woman who stopped her own car on a deserted road, who turned and fired methodically into the back seat, who then carefully shot herself in the arm, who then sped to the hospital to become the star of her own tragic drama. Meanwhile, the real tragedy reached its first awful conclusion. 7-year-old Cheryl Downs, shot in the back, the bullet tearing through her vital organs, never regained consciousness. She was pronounced dead. The motive for murder was now, in the eyes of the law, complete. Diane had succeeded in removing one of the obstacles to her fantasy life. When Detective Welch went to inform Diane of Cheryl's death, he watched her with a forensic eye. Her reaction was theatrical, a burst of exaggerated grief that seemed to mirror television melodrama more than genuine, soul-crushing loss. It solidified his belief that he was not dealing with a victim, but with a suspect of a profound and chilling cunning. The investigation now turned to motive. Why would a mother do this? The answer was found in Diane's personal life, in a bundle of passionate, desperate letters she had written to her married lover, Lou Lewiston. The letters spoke of her all-consuming love for him, and they spoke of her children as a problem. In one, she wrote plainly of her belief that if she no longer had the children, Lou would leave his wife for her. She saw their existence as the only barrier to her happiness. Here was the warped logic laid bare. Not money, not insurance, but a toxic fantasy of romantic fulfillment. Her children were not individuals to be loved. They were objects in her way, to be sacrificed on the altar of her obsession. Within days, Diane Downs was formally named the sole suspect in the murder of Cheryl Downs, and the attempted murders of Christy and Danny. She was arrested on May 25, 1983, just 6 days after the shooting, the community's fear of a shaggy-haired strang. The arrest of Diane Downs was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a legal and moral odyssey that would captivate a nation and test the very limits of the justice system. Diane, now in custody, did not crumble. Instead, she leaned into her role with a performer's conviction. To her, the trial would not be a reckoning for murder, but a stage for her grand, tragic performance, a platform to prove her love for Lou Lewiston and to cement her fabricated identity as a victim. The case was assigned to a formidable prosecutor, Lane County Deputy District Attorney Fred Hughey. For Hughey, this was not just another prosecution. He had been in the emergency room that first night. He had seen the tiny, broken bodies of Christy and Danny. He had witnessed Diane's bizarre calm. The case became a personal mission for him, a quest for justice for children who could not speak for themselves. He would later become a central protective figure in the surviving children's lives. But for now, he was building an unassailable case against their mother. The trial began in Springfield, Oregon in the spring of 1984. The media circus was immense. Diane, ever conscious of her image, appeared in court each day dressed not like an accused murderer but like a wholesome, wronged young mother, in soft sweaters, demure skirts, her hair carefully styled. She would smile at the jury. She would take meticulous notes. She projected an aura of intelligent, engaged innocence. It was a chillingly effective facade. The prosecution's case was built on a mountain of cold, physical evidence. The ballistics experts detailed how the shell casings inside the car disproved her story. The pathologist described the trajectories of the bullets through the children's bodies, consistent with being shot from the front seat. The lack of forensic evidence for a mysterious stranger was presented as a glaring absence, but the most anticipated witness was one the jury would never hear from directly, 7-year-old Cheryl Downs. Her testimony was presented through the doctors and nurses who heard her final whispered words. The phrase "Mommy shot me" hung in the courtroom, a ghostly accusation. Yet Diane's defense attorney attempted to counter this. He suggested Christy's statement was the confused product of a traumatized, brain-damaged child. He argued the investigation was biased, that the police had fixated on Diane from the start and ignored other possibilities. He played into Diane's narrative of a beautiful young mother persecuted by a system that couldn't catch the real killer. And then Diane Downs took the stand in her own defense. For days she commanded the courtroom. She was animated, detailed, and eerily persuasive. She recounted her story of the shaggy-haired stranger with renewed vigor, adding dramatic flourishes. She spoke of her love for her children, her devotion as a mother. She cried when speaking of Cheryl's death. She was, by many accounts, a compelling witness. She seemed to genuinely believe her own lies, a testament to her profound narcissism and detachment from reality. But Fred Hughey was prepared. His cross-examination was a masterclass in dismantling a facade. He did not scream or accuse. Instead, he used calm, precise questioning to highlight the countless inconsistencies in her story. He forced her to account for the unaccountable evidence, the shell casings, the lack of skid marks, the trajectory of her own wound. He exposed her priorities. He questioned her about flirting with the orderly while her children were in surgery. He confronted her with the letters to Lou Lewiston, reading aloud her own words where she lamented her children as burdens. As Hughey meticulously picked apart her performance, the cracks began to show. Diane's confident demeanor would occasionally slip, revealing flashes of anger and arrogance. The mask of the victim began to look more like the grimace of a cornered predator. The pivotal moment, however, was yet to come. The prosecution had one more witness, a living testament to the truth. A little girl who had survived the bullets, a stroke, and paralysis. A child who had to find the courage once again to point a finger at the woman who gave her life. The courtroom would soon hear, not from a ghost, but from a survivor. Christy Downs was being wheeled into the building. The atmosphere in the Springfield courtroom shifted palpably when Christy Downs was wheeled in. The jury, the judge, the spectators, All fell into a hushed, reverent silence. Here was the living evidence. Not a diagram, not a shell casing, but a small, vulnerable child whose body bore the permanent marks of that night. At 9 years old, she was paralyzed on her right side, her arm resting in a sling, her speech still labored from the stroke caused by her mother's bullet. The prosecutor, Fred Hughey, approached her with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his earlier cross-examination. His questions were simple, slow, and clear. He did not ask her to relive the shooting. Instead, he focused on the moments just before. He asked Christy what she remembered about the car ride. She whispered about the rain, about being sleepy. He asked her if she remembered the car stopping. She said yes. And then the critical question, when the car stopped, who was in the driver's seat? Christy Downs took a breath. She looked across the room, and then with a courage that belied her years and her injuries, she slowly, deliberately raised her left hand, her good hand, and pointed directly at the defense table, at her mother. She did not say a word. She didn't need to. The gesture was unmistakable, a silent, powerful accusation that echoed her whispered words from the hospital bed. Diane Downs was sitting in the driver's seat when the car stopped. There was no stranger at the window. The car didn't stop for anyone else. Diane's reaction was telling. She did not weep. She did not look away in pained anguish. Instead, she stared back at her daughter with a cold, hard, impassive gaze. It was the look of a strategist, not a mother. Any performance of maternal heartbreak was gone, replaced by a stark calculation. The jury saw it. The facade had not just cracked, it had fallen away entirely in that moment of silent pointing. The defense attorney's attempts to suggest Christy was confused or manipulated crumbled against the sheer, unadorned power of that moment. A child, broken by the woman who should have protected her, had just identified her destroyer from the witness stand. With the testimony concluded, the trial moved to its final acts. The closing arguments were a study in opposing realities. The defense painted Diane as a victim twice over, first of a violent stranger and then of a justice system desperate for a culprit. They appealed to the jury's empathy for a mother who had lost a child, but Fred Hughey's closing argument was a methodical, devastating summation of the evidence and the motive. He held up the .22 caliber revolver. He walked the jury back through the physical facts, the casings inside, the lack of evidence outside, the self-inflicted wound. Then he held up Diane's love letters to Lou Lewiston. This, he told the jury, is the why. This is the reason 3 children were shot on a rainy road. Not hatred for them, but a selfish, all-consuming love for a man who didn't want them. She viewed her own children as property that had depreciated in value, as obstacles to be removed. He spoke of Cheryl, who could not testify. He spoke of Christy's paralyzed pointing finger. He spoke of Danny's injuries. He asked the jury to see past the defendant's sweaters and smiles, to see the manipulative, narcissistic core that would sacrifice everything for a fantasy. The jury deliberated. It did not take them long. On June 17, 1984, they returned with their verdict. Diane Downs was found guilty on all counts: the murder of Cheryl Ann Downs, the attempted murder of Christy Downs, the attempted murder of Danny Downs, and the criminal assault of all 3. When the verdict was read, Diane showed no emotion at first. Then, as she was led away, she turned to the courtroom and shouted a single defiant sentence that would become infamous. "I'm not guilty! You'll never find the real murderer!" It was the final, perfect encapsulation of her pathology. Even with the evidence, the testimony, the verdict of her peers stacked against her, she clung to her fictional narrative. She was the star of her own tragedy, and in her mind, the jury was merely a misguided audience. The judge sentenced her to life in prison plus 50 years, ensuring she would never walk free. The legal chapter was closed. But for the 2 surviving children, Christy and Danny, their story and their long, painful road to finding something resembling safety was just beginning. A prison sentence is often thought of as an ending, a period at the end of a grim sentence. But for a story like this, the incarceration of the perpetrator is merely the beginning of a new, haunting chapter. For Diane Downs, Prison did not become a place of repentance or quiet reflection. It became another stage. And for her children, Christy and Danny, the gavel's fall was not a resolution, but the start of a lifelong journey to heal wounds that were far more than physical. Diane was sent to the Oregon Women's Correctional Center. Almost immediately, she began to manipulate the system and craft a new narrative. She gave interviews, maintaining her absolute innocence, spinning tales of police corruption and a failed justice system. She wrote letters, many of them collected in a book she tried to publish, portraying herself as a martyred mother. In her mind, she was not a convict. She was a political prisoner, a celebrity inmate, the tragic heroine of a great misunderstanding. Her most shocking act of defiance came just over a year into her sentence. In July of 1987, with the help of a fellow inmate, she managed to escape. For 10 days, Diane Downs was on the run, a fugitive from a life sentence. Her flight was not that of a remorseful woman seeking a new life, but the dramatic flourish of a performer refusing to leave the spotlight. She was recaptured in a small town in Massachusetts, found with a revolver and a wig, seemingly ready to continue a life on the lam. The escape only solidified her image as a dangerous, unrepentant narcissist who would never accept the truth of her own actions. Back in prison, under maximum security, her behavior continued to be telling. She would later claim, in a television interview, that if she were ever released, she would want to have more children, a statement that chilled viewers and victim advocates to the bone. It revealed a complete and terrifying lack of insight. She saw no inherent wrong in what she had done, only a strategic error that had cost her her freedom. But what of the real victims? While Diane played the martyr behind bars, Christy and Danny Downs faced a world of pain, recovery, and uncertainty. They were children who had survived an execution attempt by their own mother. Their father was not in the picture. They were orphans of a living parent. They became wards of the state carrying profound physical and psychological scars. Christy required extensive ongoing therapy and physical rehabilitation for her paralysis and speech impairments. Danny bore the physical and emotional trauma of his near-fatal injury. They had lost their sister. They had been betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. Their need for stability, for unconditional love, for true safety was absolute. That salvation came from an unexpected yet fitting source. Fred Hughey, the prosecutor who had worked so diligently to convict Diane Downs, had never forgotten the children. He and his wife Joan had grown deeply attached to Christy and Danny during the long trial process. They understood the depth of the children's trauma and the danger Diane still posed, even from prison. In a remarkable act of compassion, Fred and Joan Hughey fought to adopt Christy and Danny. They wanted to provide a permanent, loving home, a fortress of normalcy and trust. The adoption was finalized, giving the children a new name, a new family, and most importantly, a new foundation. They were shielded, their identities protected, given a chance to grow away from the monstrous shadow of their biological mother. Diane Downs, from her prison cell, fought the adoption bitterly. She saw it not as a blessing for her children, but as a final theft, the ultimate victory of the system she despised. Her opposition, of course, failed. It was perhaps the first true act of protection ever granted to Christy and Danny, the legal and permanent removal from the orbit of the woman who had tried to destroy them. Two paths, now irrevocably diverged. One led deeper into the cold, self-justifying isolation of a prison cell. The other led toward a difficult but hopeful healing within the walls of a safe and loving home. The story, it seemed, had found its equilibrium. But the deepest question of all remained, hanging in the air like a ghost. Why? What kind of mind could conceive of such an act? The search for an answer leads us into the darkest corridors of psychology, into a diagnosis that would come to define Diane Downs. To comprehend an act of such profound betrayal, we must venture beyond the facts of the crime and into the labyrinth of the mind that conceived it. The question why lingers, persistent and unsettling. Diane Downs was not psychotic in the clinical sense. She knew the difference between right and wrong. Her manipulation of the crime scene and her elaborate performance for police prove she understood the reality of her actions. The answer, instead, lies in a profound and malignant personality disorder, a twisted psychological architecture that allowed her to view her children not as human beings but as objects in the service of her own desires. Forensic psychiatrists who evaluated Diane, both during and after the trial, identified traits consistent with severe narcissistic personality disorder with strong borderline features. This is not just a label, it is a key to understanding her reality. At the core of narcissistic personality disorder is a grandiose, inflated sense of self importance, a deep need for excessive admiration, and a complete lack of empathy for others. For Diane, her wants and needs were not just priorities, they were the only reality that mattered. Her children were extensions of herself, accessories when they made her look like a good mother, and intolerable burdens when they conflicted with her primary goal, securing the devoted love of Lou Lewiston. Her love letters to Lou are not the writings of a passionate woman, but the blueprints of a pathological mind. She wrote, "I want you so much it's like a physical pain. I want to be everything to you." In her mind, to be everything meant erasing anything that competed for his attention, including his own wife, and most catastrophically, her own children. They were not individuals with rights and needs, they were obstacles on her path to a fantasy union. Removing them was, in her distorted logic, a necessary step, a small sacrifice for her grand romance. This connects to the borderline features, the intense, unstable relationships, the fear of abandonment, and the impulsive, often destructive behavior. Lou Lewiston was not just a lover, he was the source of her identity and worth. His rejection of her children was an existential threat to her. The prospect of losing him felt like annihilation. The act of shooting her children was, therefore, a grotesquely impulsive and definitive solution to this perceived threat. It was the ultimate act of control in a life she felt was spiraling away from her fantasy. Furthermore, her behavior throughout the ordeal showcases a chilling compartmentalization. She could meticulously plan a murder, execute it with cold precision, then instantly shift into the role of the hysterical, victimized mother. She could sit in court, smiling at the jury, taking notes, while testimony described her daughter's last words. This ability to separate emotion from action, to wear identities like costumes, speaks to a profound association. The mother was a role she played when it was useful. When it ceased to serve her primary narrative of romantic fulfillment, she could set it aside without apparent remorse. This is why her post-conviction behavior, the escape, the interviews, the desire for more children, is so revealing. There is no introspection, only narrative maintenance. She is not sorry for killing Cheryl and attempting to kill Christy and Danny. She is sorry she was caught. She is angry her performance was not believed. In prison, she continues to cast herself as the protagonist, the wronged woman, the fighter, the celebrity. The real victims have no place in this story except as props. This psychological profile makes the crime more understandable, yet in many ways more horrifying. It was not a sudden snap of rage. It was the logical, premeditated conclusion of a mind that placed its own fantasies above the lives of others. A mind that saw love as possession and children as property. Her betrayal was not just a violent act, it was the final expression of a worldview where everyone else was merely a supporting character in the epic drama of Diane Downs. With this understanding of the why, we can now turn to the lasting legacy of her actions. The impact did not end with a life sentence. It rippled outwards, forever altering lives, influencing law, and leaving a permanent stain on the community that struggled to comprehend how one of their own could embody such evil. The legacy of a crime like this is not contained within courtroom transcripts or prison records. It seeps into the community, alters legal and social practices, and leaves an indelible mark on popular consciousness. The Diane Downs case became more than a local tragedy. It became a cautionary tale, a psychological case study, and a grim chapter in the annals of American true crime. For the community of Springfield, Oregon, and the Lane County Sheriff's Office, the case was a profound trauma. The initial terror of a supposed random killer on the loose had been bad enough. The revelation that the perpetrator was the victim's own mother was a different kind of shock, a deeper, more insidious violation of trust that left people questioning instincts and appearances. The detectives and prosecutors involved carried the weight of the children's suffering with them for years. For Fred Hugie, it became a defining mission of his life, one that extended far beyond the courtroom into a lifelong commitment to protect Christy and Danny. The case also underscored the critical importance of forensic detail in skeptical investigation. The careful analysis of the bullet trajectories, the shell casing locations, and the blood spatter patterns was what dismantled Diane's emotionally compelling but factually impossible story. It became a textbook example for law enforcement. Human behavior can lie, but physical evidence tells a consistent story. It also highlighted the need to listen to the most vulnerable witnesses, like a gravely injured child whispering the truth from a hospital bed. But perhaps the most pervasive legacy was its entry into the public imagination. The case captivated the nation, and in 1987, renowned true crime author Anne Rule published Small Sacrifices, a meticulous and devastating account of the crime. The book became a massive bestseller, delving deeper than the headlines into Diane's twisted psychology and the investigation's painstaking work. It cemented Diane Downs in the public mind as an archetype of the monstrous, narcissistic mother. The story was later adapted into a television miniseries, further amplifying its reach and ensuring that the names Diane, Christy, Cheryl, and Danny would not be forgotten. And what of those names? What became of the people at the heart of this storm? Christy and Danny Hugie, as they became, were given the greatest gifts possible after such a betrayal: anonymity and stability. Raised by Fred and Joan Hugie, they were shielded from the media and from their biological mother's endless attempts to contact or manipulate them. Their journey was not easy. The physical and psychological scars were deep. Reports suggest Christy underwent numerous surgeries and endured a long, arduous rehabilitation, but within the safety of their adoptive home, they were given a chance to heal, to be ordinary children, and eventually to become adults separate from the horror of their early years. They have maintained a strict private silence, a testament to their desire to live lives defined not by victimhood, but by their own choices. Their resilience is the most powerful rebuttal to Diane's act of destruction. Lou Lewiston, the man whose rejection sparked the tragedy, faded from public view, his life forever shadowed by the grim knowledge of his role, however unintended, in the catalyst of the crime. And Diane Downs? She remains incarcerated at the Coffee Creek Correctional Facility in Oregon. Now in her late 60s, she has been denied parole multiple times. At every hearing, her lack of remorse is noted. She continues to maintain her complete innocence, spinning ever more elaborate conspiracy theories. She has become a fixture of the prison system, known for her manipulative behavior and her ongoing attempts to litigate and write her way back into the public narrative. The performance never ended. The fantasy never died. The woman who lived for a delusion remains trapped within one, her only audience now the corrections officers and fellow inmates who see the reality she still refuses to acknowledge. Her story raises unanswerable, haunting questions about nature, nurture, and the origins of such profound brokenness. Was she born with a wiring that lacked empathy, or was her personality forged in a childhood she later described as unhappy and seeking validation? We may never know, but her case stands as a stark monument to the fact that the most dangerous predators are not those who lurk in alleyways, but those who can perfectly mimic love all while plotting a sacrifice of everything we hold sacred. As we reach the end of this harrowing journey, we are left not with a sense of closure, but with a heavy, lingering contemplation. The story of Diane Downs forces us to stare into an abyss, not of random evil, but of a calculated, intimate betrayal that perverts the very essence of human connection. It challenges the foundational stories we tell ourselves about love, family, and protection. What wisdom can possibly be found in pain this profound? The pain of a child whispering, "Mommy shot me." The pain of a sister lost forever. The pain of a community deceived. Perhaps it is not wisdom in the traditional sense, but a series of stark, uncomfortable truths that such a case burns into our awareness. The first truth is this: evil often wears a familiar face. It does not always snarl, it smiles, it charms, it tells us exactly what we want to hear. Diane Downs was not a monster from a fable. She was a neighbor, a co-worker, a mother at the school gate. Her greatest weapon was her ability to appear normal, to perform the role of a loving parent so convincingly that the unthinkable became, for a time, unseeable. This case reminds us to trust not just appearances, but actions, to listen to the quiet, discordant notes of intuition, like those nurses in the ER who sensed the performance behind the panic. The second truth is about the terrifying plasticity of love in a disordered mind. In Diane's world, love was not a selfless bond, it was a form of consumption and control. Her love for Lou Lewiston was an obsession that demanded the sacrifice of others. Her love for her children was conditional, existing only when it served her self image. This story lays bare the danger when love is twisted into a mirror that only reflects one's own desires, a lesson that echoes far beyond this single crime. The final, most crucial truth is about resilience. For all the darkness in this story, there is a powerful, enduring light, the survival of Christy and Danny. Theirs is the counter narrative. They represent the human spirit's capacity to endure, to heal, and to choose a different path. Protected by the fierce, devoted love of Fred and Joan Hugie, they built lives of quiet normality, the ultimate rebuke to the woman who tried to erase them. Their choice to live in silence, away from the glare of the tragedy, is not an absence, it is a presence. It is the presence of a hard-won peace, a sanctuary built on the very trust that was once so brutally shattered. And what of Diane? She remains a closed loop, a system of self-justification spinning in a cell. Her refusal to acknowledge the truth even now is the final tragic proof of her imprisonment within herself. She is a living lesson in the consequences of a life lived without empathy, where people are merely players in one's own drama. Her punishment is not just the loss of liberty, but the permanent exile from the authentic human connections she so casually destroyed. So we are left with a stark duality. In one reality, a woman forever performing for an audience that no longer believes her. In another, survivors who turn their backs on the script she wrote for them, choosing their own stories of quiet strength. The covenant was broken, irrevocably, but from the ruins of that broken promise, something else was built, not by the betrayer, but by the betrayed. A testament to the fact that while pain can be inflicted in a single violent moment, healing is a lifelong act of courage. And sometimes wisdom after pain is simply the quiet understanding of which bonds are worth protecting, and the fierce resolve to never again confuse a performance for love. This has been the story of Diane Downs, a story where the monster was not a stranger, but the architect of a home, a reminder to look closely, to listen to whispers, and to never underestimate the quiet strength it takes to survive, to point a finger at the darkness, and then finally to turn and walk toward the light. If you've stayed with this story until the end, thank you. Your time and attention to these difficult narratives is deeply appreciated. If you find value in these deep dives into real stories of betrayal and resilience, Please consider subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you know, and it ensures you won't miss our next exploration of the wisdom that comes only through understanding life's hardest lessons. Before we close this chapter completely, it's important to step back from the narrative and reflect on how we come to know a story like this. The details, the dialogue, the psychological insights, they don't materialize from thin air. They are painstakingly gathered, verified, and woven together by journalists, authors, and investigators who dedicate years to uncovering the truth. The definitive account of the Diane Downs case is Anne Rule's best-selling book, Small Sacrifices. Published in 1987, it is a masterpiece of true crime reporting. Rule, a former police officer herself, had unprecedented access to the investigation. She attended the trial daily, interviewed detectives, prosecutors, witnesses, and even corresponded with Diane Downs. Her book provides the granular, novelistic detail that allows us to understand the sequence of events, the characters involved, and the chilling atmosphere of the courtroom. It is from her meticulous work that we learn of Diane's private smiles in the hospital, the contents of her love letters, and the devastating impact on the children. Rule's work is so foundational that it raises an ethical question we often face with true crime. How do we consume such stories responsibly? This tale is not entertainment. It is a real-life tragedy that ended one life and irrevocably damaged others. When we listen to a story like this, we owe it to the victims, Cheryl, Christy, and Danny, to remember their humanity first, to not glorify the perpetrator, but to seek understanding of the mechanisms of betrayal so we might recognize its warning signs in our own world. The purpose is not voyeurism, but vigilance, not sensationalism, but a sober reflection on the fragility of trust. This case also leaves us with unanswered, perhaps unanswerable questions. Questions about the nature of evil. Is it a force that some are born with, or is it cultivated? Can a personality be so fundamentally broken that redemption is impossible? Diane Downs' complete and enduring lack of remorse suggests a void where conscience should be. Her reality is so self-referential that the suffering of others simply does not compute as meaningful. For most of us, that is the most alien and terrifying concept of all. Finally, this story is a testament to the heroes who appear in the aftermath, not just Fred Hugie, whose compassion created a new family from the ashes of an old one, but the nurses who noted their suspicions, the detectives who pursued physical truth over a compelling lie, and the jurors who saw through the performance to the cold facts. They represent the systems, medical, legal, social, that must function correctly to catch a wolf in sheep's clothing. They are the antidote to the chaos. As you go from this story, carry this final thought. The world contains profound darkness, but it is matched by equal measures of resilience and light. The legacy of May 19th, 1983, is not solely Diane Downs' crime. It is also Christie's courage on the witness stand. It is Danny's chance at a peaceful life. It is the Hugie family's unwavering love. It is in the quiet, determined work of those who piece truth back together after it has been shattered by a lie. We tell these stories not to dwell in the darkness, but to better recognize the shapes it can take and to honor the light that persists and even grows in spite of it. Thank you again for listening. If this journey into the psychology of betrayal resonated with you, please do subscribe for more real stories. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you in the next video.